you all so much for being here. Just wanted to let folks know this event is being recorded and we'll post it to our YouTube video, our YouTube channel afterwards. So my name is Dr. Jessica Nielson. I'm the founder and president of the Psychedelic Society of Minnesota. And then I was also appointed by Governor Walz in 2023 and elected to serve as the chairperson of the Psychedelic Medicine Task Force. And then this year, I took on the role of a lobbyist, a new lobbyist, to try to get psychedelic therapy, specifically psilocybin mushroom therapy, approved here in Minnesota, based on the recommendations of the task force. So I'll hand it over first, let me just go over the agenda for today. So we'll just briefly do some introductions, like I introduced myself. We'll talk about how this all got started with the initiation of the Psychedelic Medicine Task Force, what bills have been introduced, how those moved through this session in 2026, and what's going to be the plan moving forward in 2027 and beyond. And then we'll open it up for a Q&A with myself and Rep. Smith to answer any questions you might have about how the process went and what are the next steps for getting involved. So Rep. Smith, do you want to come on screen or mic and introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. Hello, everybody. Representative Andy Smith. I serve in the Minnesota House of Representatives, District 25B, which is downtown Rochester and the surrounding areas. I have been working on this since 2023. I was the chief author in the House of the Psychedelic Medicine Task Force, served on the task force as a representative for the House for the entirety of its existence, working with Dr. Nielson and others. And this year was the chief author on several bills pushing psychedelic medicine and psychedelics generally further in our state, and will continue to do so. Knock on wood if I am reelected next year. So happy to be here. I truly am thankful for all of you and your advocacy, and a lot of you with your help hands-on on making this legislation as good as it could be. And I'm excited to give you all a debrief. So thank you for setting this up, and let's get rolling.
Thanks so much, Rep. Smith. All right, so I'm going to go through this somewhat as quickly as I can so we can really just open this up for a discussion between Rep. Smith and myself and fielding questions from all of y'all who are attending. And thank you all for joining us and taking an interest in what we're doing here. So all of this work got started basically in 2023 when Rep. Smith, along with some other folks in the legislature, created a bill that eventually got added to a larger health omnibus bill that created this psychedelic medicine task force. And so what this did was it created this sort of like legislatively created working group that met over a 14-month period starting in November of 2023. All of the members were appointed by the governor to serve different roles. So this was half members from like various state agencies like the Department of Health, the Department of Commerce, the Department of Public Safety, someone from the Attorney General's office, the governor's office, and then representatives from the legislature. So we had two senators and two representatives from both the GOP and the DFL parties. And someone from the Board of Pharmacy as well. I might be missing an agency, but it was quite comprehensive in terms of sort of like representing the state government side. And then on the public side, there was additional people that volunteered to be reviewed and selected and appointed by the governor. This included a psychiatrist, a clinical psychologist, an addiction medicine expert, a public health expert, and myself as sort of the only person in the state at the time that was doing clinical trials with psychedelics, the only person sort of legally authorized to administer psychedelics, particularly psilocybin in a clinical trial context. And then we had also two veterans that had treatment-resistant mental health conditions, and additionally two patients with treatment-resistant mental health conditions, as well as members from the two different tribes. In Minnesota, there's 11 tribes, but one representing the Ojibwe tribes and one representing the Dakota tribes. And then we all got together to kind of discuss over this 14-month period, what would it look like to create a psychedelic medicine program in Minnesota, learning from things based on what was happening in Oregon and Colorado at the time, what was bubbling up in New Mexico that just got approved last year, and how can we do that in our state, recognizing that psychedelics are fundamentally Schedule I drugs, and so anything we do at the state level would be in violation of federal law. And so how do we navigate the legal realities of doing that similar to a medical cannabis program, and how do you kind of sidestep federal conflicts while still being able to provide access to people safely and responsibly? How do we stay updated on the scientific research? Because there's so many clinical trials happening with psychedelics that it's really important to figure out what are these medicines potentially useful for, and what is the evidence for the potential qualifying conditions that we might consider them to be available to be used as for treatment for these really hard to treat conditions like depression, substance use disorders, generalized anxiety, things like that, post-traumatic stress disorder. So at the end of our work, we basically produced a 200-page legislative report that was very comprehensive, detailing all of those things. And what would it look like to actually prop this up and regulate a program here in Minnesota? And so that report was submitted in January of 2025, and it got a lot of attention. And the bills that we're going to be talking about today were really born out of the recommendations of the task force. And so basically, the three main recommendations that we kind of decided on through a democratic process by a two-thirds supermajority vote, we decided to officially recommend that the state create a clinical program for therapeutic administration of psilocybin mushrooms, a separate recommendation to remove criminal penalties for personal use and possession of psilocybin-containing mushrooms, essentially decriminalization, and to allocate funding for more research and clinical trials into the health benefits of MDMA, psilocybin, and LSD, which were the three psychedelic medicines that we were tasked with studying. But there are obviously other psychedelics out there. We hear a lot right now about ibogaine, which a lot of states are passing legislation to get more funding for clinical trials and things like that. So the conversation in the space is moving pretty rapidly, and the policy is shifting every month, it seems like. And so let's get into actually what happened from this. So from those recommendations, there was a couple bills introduced first in 2024, or sorry, 2025. Once the report was submitted, Rep. Smith was great about getting two different bills introduced. One was this HF 2906 in the House. So HF means House File 2906, SF means Senate file because you need a version in the House and the Senate. So the original version of the Therapeutic Access Program was introduced in, I believe, April of 2025 by Rep. Smith as HF 2906, as well as the other recommendation for decriminalizing psilocybin mushrooms with HF 2699. Given that those were introduced pretty late in the session last year, there wasn't really time to get a committee hearing or move anything through. So those just kind of sat and they were assigned to different committees. I believe the decriminalization bill was referred to basically like the Public Safety Judiciary Committee, and then the psilocybin therapy program was assigned to the Health Committee. But we didn't have any movement on that until we actually started movement in 2026 this year. So once the legislative session started in February, we basically had additional bills ready to go. So we'd already had HF 2906 introduced and 2699 introduced, and we needed Senate companions to those bills, which means we needed to secure authors on the Senate side to get those introduced. And so at the beginning of 2026 legislative session in February, we got that done with SF 3971 for the therapeutic pilot program, and then SF 4204, which was the kind of Senate version of the decriminalization bill. Now, in thinking about how to actually get these bills to move through, we recognize that obviously our legislature was pretty closely divided. The House was completely evenly split, so it's a 67-67 split. So every committee in the House has a shared gavel so that there's co-chairs of every committee, and then they take turns who actually is sort of having the gavel for each of those committees. And so it's a very, very tight process in terms of trying to get bipartisan support, because if any legislation is moving through along party lines, you're going to get a deadlock there. So that's how the House was set up. And on the Senate side, there was, I think, a one vote majority, one seat majority. So typically, if you're passing legislation, you just need a simple majority to pass. So that would be 51%. So that having that one extra seat really does help get things moving through, unless you have some people in the party that are not voting according to that. And so it can be interesting. But there was a little bit more of an advantage for the DFL party on the Senate side for things to move through. But regardless of that, we really were seeing that we had a lot of interest and a lot of bipartisan support. We had Rep. West and Rep. Smith both on the task force on the House side. And then on the Senate side, we had Senator Curran, who is a GOP. And then we kind of had an alteration of different people that were kind of coming in and off at the task force. For the Democratic side, eventually landing on Senator Dibble, who's been the chief author of a lot of the cannabis bills. And then as we started looking for additional authors for some of these bills, we started seeing that a lot of the people we talked to were very supportive of this and either were okay with voting for it or willing to sign on as an author to the bill. But we also wanted to make sure that we were able to get the language of this legislation moving through, because no bills can kind of move through the process unless they're heard in the appropriate committees, so that the folks that have proper jurisdiction over what's in the bill can really look at the merits of it, look at the language, make sure that it's really being carefully considered before it's written into law and something that the state is mandated to do. And so in order to do that, it's a very tricky process trying to get hearings scheduled for these bills. You know, there's usually a lot of bills introduced. Not everything gets their day on the committee or on the floor. So we had this interesting strategy of having two different versions of each bill. So we had mirror bills that one was like DFL led, which with this HF 2906 with Rep Smith, and then on the Senate side, Senator Umuver Baton championing the therapeutic pilot program on the DFL side. And then on the GOP side in the House, we had Representative Reimer, who's a freshman representative who thought that this was a really interesting topic and took it up as a champion in this session and secured additional authors. And then on the Senate side, it was Senator Mark Curran, who was chief authoring this bill and got a few other authors to do that. On the DFL, on the House side, you can have, I think, up to 30 co-authors on a bill, but on the Senate side, you're limited to 5. So we were able to get at least 9 senators to sign on to various versions of this bill, kind of signaling broad bipartisan and bicameral support. So that means both the House and the Senate seem to be supportive of it. And then the decriminalization bill, which I'm going to focus on less because that didn't move too much this session, but that did have sort of a few authors on the House side led by Rep Smith, and then only a couple authors on the Senate side. But this was definitely not a bipartisan supported bill. Decriminalization is really a topic that doesn't bode well in conversations with Republican legislators and public safety professionals and law enforcement and things like that, because it kind of takes away another tool in the toolkit. So it usually doesn't go very well. So I don't think this would ever really have a chance in Minnesota unless we had a Democratic trifecta at some point. So that might happen. But as it was going this session, there was really no appetite for this to be included. And if it was in any of the therapeutic access bills, it would never have received the amount of bipartisan support it did. Okay, so hopefully that all made sense. Like I said, I'm a new lobbyist. This whole process is fairly new to me, so I'm sort of describing it as I've been figuring it out. Um, and the conversation, I mean, we were already getting a lot of Republicans that were very supportive of this. I think I maybe talked to 1 or 2 people that were just like not really willing to sit down and have a conversation with me on the Republican side. But for the most part, people were pretty supportive of this, especially when you approach it in terms of like how this could treat PTSD in first responders or our veteran population. And that really seems to land well with the Republicans. And so that's been garnering support for the last several years. But then on April 18th, President Trump signed an executive order basically accelerating psychedelic research, trying to loosen some of the restrictions for how to do some of this work. Because I can tell you, as being a principal investigator doing clinical trials of psychedelics, it's a lot of paperwork. There's a lot of roadblocks. There's a lot of red tape. It's very, very hard to do, on top of it being controversial. So this is hopefully going to make that process a little bit easier. And there was also an announcement of $50 million being made available to help fund states that are trying to help provide more data into whether psychedelics like psilocybin, ibogaine, ayahuasca, things like that do have accepted medical use, which is one of the criteria for taking some of these drugs off Schedule 1. And that's typically done through like the traditional clinical trials process. But as we saw with MDMA, even going through that whole process, you still cannot get a new drug approved by the FDA. And I think there's a recognition at the federal level that this process is very slow and that we haven't had a new pharmaceutical drug or any kind of new treatment that isn't just new forms of talk therapy approved by the FDA for mental health conditions in over 40 years. And so we really need to figure out a better approach. And so hopefully this is getting at that. And this $50 million that's been allocated by the federal government to support states looking into this, hopefully will help make the conversation a little bit easier, because in all of the conversations we were having with folks about supporting this therapeutic access program, the main concern was the cost. How much is this going to cost the state? How much is this going to cost people trying to access this? Like, where's that money going to come from? And what is that going to look like moving forward? So this hopefully will help alleviate some of that financial pressure, but we also don't really fully know what this federal funding criteria will look like. So that's something that hopefully we'll continue to monitor as things progress. So this is just kind of a high level overview of how things moved with these different bills in both the House and the Senate. So basically, we saw more movement and more attention to the bills in the House. So the HF 2906, which was the therapeutic pilot program, was referred to the Health Committee when it was initially introduced. And so we were able to get a committee hearing with the DFL chair, Chair Bierman, on March 9th. And we had a wonderful hearing on that day. It was a Monday morning. Folks came out, and we had about, I think, 14 people come and testify live. And we also had, I think, another 15 or so people submit written testimony. And had a really great discussion. There seemed to be a lot of support. And when it came time to vote on whether to pass this on to the next committee, which I believe was the Commerce Committee, it passed almost unanimously with a single nay vote. So that was really exciting. And that gained a lot of attention in press, and we were really excited about that. And
Can I
we
jump,
were also,
can I jump
yep,
in here for a second, Jessica, just to
sure.
say, those on this call, if you have not, if you want to like watch any of these or go back and like the March 9th committee hearing in the House is really where you should go to see like the community showed up in an amazing way from across the spectrum of people who have been involved in this to talk about how important this has been to a wide variety of people. It's a really, really moving testimony. March 9th is like everything that we wanted when we were talking about this. Several people on the work that are on the work group are on this call. We know we've talked about this for years. March 9th was a great, great day. So I also just want to say thank you to everyone who participated in that. But also, if you haven't seen it, that's really the one to show like that. I think that is where we started really gaining momentum because of the work of a lot of people on this call and the community as a whole. So I just wanted to add that as well as Jessica goes through all of these committees. If you want to go back and see one, I would recommend March 9th.
Yeah, thanks for highlighting that. And I spent some time last night doing some screen captures of all the hearings. So there was like the House hearing in the Health Committee, there was the Veterans Committee, there was the full floor discussion, and then there was the weird activity on the Senate side that I'll get into. And so I have all of those ready. It's like almost 3 hours of content, but if you want to like really dig into all the testimony, all the discussion by the legislators, um, I will have that posted on our YouTube channel once I can get all that compiled together because it's a lot of footage. But I want to have that kind of memorialized as like this is how it went through because it was really an incredible session, and I'm really bummed ultimately that we didn't get the therapy program passed, which I'll get into in a second. But I think the groundwork was laid, and you'll see if you like look through all of the positive press that happened about this and the actual like testimony and the hearings and the discussion between legislators about this, it was very popular. And it only sort of didn't pass because of bureaucracy, to be honest. It got all the way up to the finish line and wasn't able to get through because of, I guess, different procedures of how legislation is supposed to move through and people wanting to be sticking to the rules of how that works. And we can go into that in a little bit. Um, so after the bill was heard in the Health Committee in the House, there was a lot of positive press. We were very excited. It was referred to the Commerce Committee because we added the Office of Cannabis Management into the bill to basically regulate the program similar to how they've regulated the medical cannabis program, obviously with some clear distinctions, but the fact that it's having to navigate a medicinal product that you can source within the state that's fundamentally violating a federal law. And so they already have kind of the infrastructure and know how to do this. And so that's why it was referred to the Commerce Committee. But for some reason, there came a point in the session where bills in the Commerce Committee just stopped moving through. They weren't going to allow any more hearings. And so the bill basically kind of got stuck there for HF 2906. Thankfully, we had this other version of the bill, HF 4577, which was led by Representative Max Reimer. So what he did, because that was also assigned to the Health Committee, so what he did was on the House floor, he made a motion to basically have the chair of the Health Committee, who basically already heard this language, give up his jurisdiction to hear this bill. And let it move to the Veterans Committee. And the chair of that committee, one of the co-chairs of that committee, Chair Matt Bliss, was really excited about the potential of this therapy pilot program and wanted to hear it in the committee. So on the floor, they were able to get that re-referred from the Health Committee to the Veterans Committee. And then we had a hearing on that on April 15th. We had a couple testifiers and a pretty good debate about the merits of the program and the need for it. But given that it was basically the last committee meeting for this specific committee, they basically were laying over a bunch of bills, meaning they don't vote on them, but they sort of let them be discussed and then they kind of just fall to the wayside. I'm not exactly sure how laying over something works. Maybe Rep. Smith can answer that in a minute. But basically, it could potentially go into an omnibus bill. It could be added to a larger budget bill, but sometimes it just means that it's sort of just like stuck in a shelf or something like that. And it's unknown what will happen. And basically, any bill that was moving through this session is going to have to be made into a new bill next session because these was part of a biennium, I believe. So the 2025, 2026 bills that had their shot basically need to be rewritten and resubmitted as new bills at the beginning of 2027. So it's not like these things can be recycled and they're sitting in a drawer and they can just continue the conversation next session. We'll just have to like reintroduce these same bills and hopefully get the same authors if they all get reelected in November. So after that, that was promising. We were really hoping that this would get put to a vote in the Veterans Committee and get referred over to Ways and Means, which is basically the final committee where they work out like the budget and how much a bill will cost before it goes to the floor for a full vote. But thankfully, we've got some pretty awesome champions in the House that were like, we're just gonna try to do something radical here, even though we didn't get it through the process to make it through as a standalone on its own to a full floor vote on the House. There was a play to try to add it to the health omnibus bill because that's how the first bill came through with the Psychedelic Medicine Task Force when that was created in 2023. So basically, initially, Senator Curran tried to do this on the Senate floor when they were talking about the health omnibus bill. And because in the Senate, it never got a hearing. We tried to get a committee hearing in the health committee, but for a variety of reasons, we weren't able to actually get that done in time before bills have to be out of committee before a certain deadline. There's like deadlines in March for policy bills, and then there's deadlines in April for bills that have a fiscal impact or a budget. And so we basically didn't get it into a hearing in the health committee on the Senate side in time for those deadlines. And after that, basically procedure says if it didn't get a committee hearing, then you basically can't consider it. People can try and they can do what's called a suspension of the rules to kind of bypass that process, but you need a supermajority in order to do that. And like I said, everything was very, very tight this session. So what Senator Curran did on the floor of the Senate when they were talking about the health omnibus bill was introduce the full pilot program that had already been heard on the House side as an amendment to this health omnibus bill. It wasn't necessarily seen as a friendly amendment to the chief author of the Senate health bill. So he basically introduced it in order to just talk about it, have the discussion of like, this is something that we need to find a pathway for because we want this to happen in Minnesota. It builds upon the recommendations of the task force. Let's talk about this. Let's find a way. Let's put it somewhere before the end of the session was the message. But then he withdrew the amendment. So there wasn't a vote. There wasn't like a lengthy discussion about it. It was just sort of to kind of get it on the record on the Senate side. And then there was an additional hearing for the decriminalization bill in the Senate Judiciary Committee. And that was just because the chair of that committee decided to give every bill that was referred to his committee a chance to be heard, which was nice. So we got another hearing in the Senate for the decriminalization bill, had a pretty good discussion, but that was also laid over. But it seemed to have some support, and we were thinking that potentially we tried to add an amendment to this bill to add the therapy pilot program, but that ultimately didn't work out. Just because it was seen as maybe just too out of left field and not really within scope of what the Judiciary Committee would want to hear for that specific bill. So trying to get it added to the health omnibus bill on the Senate side didn't really go. I would have loved for them to just say, let's just vote on it and see, because I really do think we had the votes. Of all the conversations I had throughout this session, we really did have, I think, broad bipartisan support to be able to get this to pass. So I was a little disappointed that that wasn't brought for a vote, but I understood why, because it's a democratically led Senate, and for a Republican to bring a bill as this kind of like radical amendment to something that hadn't gone through any committees was kind of a thing that probably wouldn't have gone over well. And so ultimately that was decided not to like push through. However, on the House side, they decided to go for it. And I'm really glad for that because there was this discussion. So Rep. Smith stood up and said, I'm going to introduce this amendment to this Senate version of the health bill that had already passed. So this SF 4612 that Senator Curran tried to add the pilot bill to. So that version of the health bill was approved by the Senate. It then goes to the House, and then they have to look through it, decide whether they agree with it or whether they want to add anything to it. So they added a bunch of amendments, including the addition of the psilocybin therapy pilot program. So this would have been the full program. And Rep. Smith got up and had a very wonderful discussion about the merits of the bill, the program, the fact that it's a recommendation from the task force. And then folks from the other side of the aisle got up and spoke in favor of it. And there was this beautiful discussion on both sides of the aisle where it was just very supportive. Just basically, it seemed like everybody was on board. And then when it came time to do a roll call and a vote, it basically passed with 88%, 114 to 15 votes. Like that's huge in such a divided legislature where everything was so tight and hardly anything made it through this session. I think that's a resounding message that this is very, very popular. And not only do the people of the state want this, but the legislators that represent those people are supportive of making this happen. Unfortunately, so when the House adds a bunch of stuff to a bill that the Senate's already approved and the House adds stuff, the Senate has to then look at it and decide whether they concur with all those changes before it gets moved on to getting signed into law or going to the governor's desk. And unfortunately, the Senate didn't concur with all of the amendments that were added. So they basically met in what's called conference committee, where they sit there and they try to duke it out with some people from the House and some people from the Senate. I think it was 8 people that get together in a room behind closed doors. It's not necessarily made open to the public or votes are made not knowable. I don't think there's a vote tally anywhere. And then they decide what does the final version of this bill look like that both the Senate and the House can agree on before sending it off to the governor's desk to sign. So unfortunately, our pilot program did not make the final cut in the health omnibus bill, despite all this work and all this support. But there was sort of this plan B strategy that we were working to get some kind of language approved this session, because based on the executive order from President Trump and the Department of Health and Human Services and allocating this $50 million, it sounds like from other regulators in like Oregon and Colorado that states that want to be eligible for this $50 million of funding need to have something in statute that directs their regulatory agency to apply for this funding. So this gets us to that. And this actually was added as an amendment to the larger cannabis bill that was first heard in the Senate Finance Committee when we added this as an amendment. And then the House adopted that language as well, and that's off to the governor's desk, hopefully to be signed. And basically, what this does is it produces a report. And this is just kind of the process of how things work through the legislature, where a bill is introduced. You have various committees, it goes to a full floor vote on the House and the Senate. And then if there's disagreement, they have this conference committee. And then whatever moves through goes to the governor's desk to be signed or vetoed. If it's vetoed, it can go back and it needs a supermajority to override that. But ultimately, this is where we're at right now, is this study language, this Plan B language is sitting on the governor's desk. Hopefully he'll sign that in the next week or so. But this is basically what actually did get passed. So we didn't have a total failure this session. We did get something approved that is going to be written into statute that essentially directs the Office of Cannabis Management to continue to monitor what they would need from a regulatory development and implementation standpoint to create this therapeutic psilocybin program, leaning on the work that's already been done by the Psychedelic Medicine Task Force, because like I said, that 200-page report really is sort of like a playbook for how to do this well. So there is a lot of investment that's already been given by the state to sort of develop this and see what would be needed, but we also need to factor in additional things as new medical conditions that are coming out every month with promising clinical trials, and what are going to be these qualifying medical conditions that patients could be diagnosed with that might make them eligible to participate in this program if and when it gets approved, and to also monitor the federal funding situation and see if and when they can apply for that money and how much they would actually need. And then to submit a report with recommendations by January 15th of 2027 ahead of the next legislative session, which hopefully will also come along with new bills that will basically be the implementation of these recommendations so we can get this pilot program approved. And hopefully it'll sail through in 2027 because we've done so much groundwork to lay out all this support. So looking towards 2027, we want to continue to monitor state and federal progress towards psilocybin therapy. I would say folks, OCM is basically going to have to figure out how to decide what they need to develop and implement a psilocybin therapeutic access program for people with qualifying medical health conditions. So they might be reaching out for support from, subject matter experts in the community for that, as well as other state agencies, other states doing this, and folks in the federal government. Also, just connecting with your legislators, not only the people that represent you, but the people that have been championing this issue in our legislature, like the bill authors in both the House and the Senate. And then just stay connected and educated as the science and the policy evolve because everything's moving very quickly. And so I just wanted to give a big thank you to all of our bill authors. So this is everyone that signed on to the various versions of the bill that I described. So this was HF 2906, which was chief authored by Rep. Smith, with second author Rep. West. So this is, bipartisan authorship. We have Rep. Hollins, Gomez, Young, Jordan, Sensor-Mura, Rapinski, Lee, and Reimer. And then there's this mirror bill version of this HF 4577, which is essentially the same thing. And we got the language to be identical eventually through some various amendments that was led by Republican Representative Max Reimer. Rep. Smith co-signed onto that. And then we have Rep. West, Rep. Gordon, and Rep. Bliss, who are all GOP authors. On the Senate side, we had Senator Claire Omer Verbatim chief authoring the Senate version of the Therapeutic Access Bill for psilocybin with co-authors, Mark Coran, who's a Republican, Senator Bolden, Senator Port, and Senator Seeberger. And then the mirror bill to that with the sort of GOP authors with one DFL author, Senator Putnam. So we have Senator Coran again, Senator Abler, and Senator Barr. And then for the decriminalization bill, we just had Senator Omer Verbatim and Senator Mayquig. So big thank you to all of them because it just demonstrates this broad bipartisan bicameral support with being able to get so many authors to be added onto this to support this, as well as everyone else that was helping to move this through. I also want to thank all of the testifiers. These are the ones I got screen captures on that came on camera for that health committee. It was very powerful. I think it really moved a lot of people. If anybody was on the fence, they definitely weren't by the end of this testimony with, again, the one the one person that didn't vote for it, who I will just say they were sleeping during the testimony, so maybe they weren't able to hear just how powerful it was. But it was, I think, a testament to just how much this is needed and how much it's wanted, how helpful it can be for people as a transformational, life-changing experience. And we should have access to this here in Minnesota. Also want to thank, this is just a list of people that submitted written testimony. I'm not going to go into all of them, but thank you to everyone that just helped lend your credibility, your lived experience, your professional opinions about this. Really appreciate all that. I think it did a lot to change a lot of hearts and minds during the process, and obviously our dream team. So this is me, Curtis Hanna, who's a lobbyist that we were working with to help do this. He's been a cannabis lobbyist for a long time and has moved more recently into the psychedelic medicine space. He was the one that helped Rep. Smith get the psychedelic medicine task force legislation initially written and moved through, obviously, our wonderful champion, Representative Smith. This is Rep. Reimer, who was the GOP author on the House side. And then Buck Humphrey, who's another lobbyist on our team, who's been a lobbyist for like 20 years. He's mostly been working in like the pharmaceutical, Medicaid type space. And has recently taken on an interest in psychedelic medicines because he was previously working for Lykos, who was the company that was trying to push MDMA therapy for PTSD when they were looking at how to get this integrated into states' medical systems and boards of pharmacy and things like that. So thank you to all that, and especially thanks. So this is how the final House floor vote went, just showing just all the green are yes votes, and this was just such a huge win. And if nothing else from this session, I'd say getting it to the House floor to have such an overwhelming landslide of a vote, I think is a win, even if we didn't get the full pilot program approved this session. So thank you everyone for attending, and now we'll stop there and go to Q&A with myself and Rep. Smith. So it looks like we have a question in the chat or in the Q&A. So I'm a yoga teacher and a breathwork coach. Neither accolade necessarily helps me sit in or help administer monitor psilocybin assisted therapies, though this is true passion and calling. What is the best certificate or program I can pursue now in anticipation of clinical legalization efforts? Yeah, that's a really good question. So initially for the pilot program that we were trying to push this session, really the only facilitators that would be authorized to do this for this limited rollout of a pilot program would be people that have a mental health license. So somebody that's like a licensed marriage and family therapist or a social worker or a licensed professional clinical counselor or clinical psychologist. those kind of folks, because we're dealing with people that are seeking out treatment with severe mental health conditions. We really do want people that have training in how to deal with those. That's not to say that anybody facilitating a psilocybin experience needs to have all that training. But if you're dealing with somebody who also has severe mental health conditions, you really need those extra tools in your toolkit because it's not trivial to manage somebody having a full-blown like suicidal like episode or depressive major depressive episode or a PTSD trigger, so we really need people that have those tools. Other states like Colorado do have a more broad approach where they kind of have it, you have the option is kind of pick what you want. You can do it with a licensed mental health professional, or you can just kind of do it with some civilian, or I don't know what you would call it, like non-mental health professional facilitator. I think they do that in Oregon as well. But again, I think that comes with risks that, we just have to be mindful of, like, these are very mind-altering experiences. And when you add on a really severe mental health condition, it's probably best to kind of take this slow. Especially when we have a lot of eyes on us, both from the state trying to figure out, is this going to work? Is this something we want to expand? And is this going to be good data that the federal government can consider as something that kind of looks like data that's collected when we're doing a clinical research study and saying, does this treatment work for this condition? So really, when I set up the pilot, it was really designed to be kind of like a clinical trial, and that there needs to be eligibility requirements, clear safety guardrails, and sort of a time-limited access approach so that you could see if the treatment worked or not and whether we wanted to expand it. So the training programs that are involved, those would be separate. So there's like probably 10 or 15 of them that both Oregon and Colorado use, where you basically complete like a 150-hour certificate program, where you learn the basics of psychedelic therapy, best practices for sitting. And so some of these training programs have been given like accreditation by Oregon and Colorado psilocybin therapy programs, so that if you get those certificates, you're authorized to be a facilitator. But each state has different requirements on who can be a facilitator in addition to having that certificate. So Minnesota is going to look different from Oregon. Oregon looks different from Colorado. We're probably going to be more similar if this pilot were approved to New Mexico, which is really more of like a medical program, trying to keep it within the context of these strict like treatment facilities, and having licensed health professionals doing the facilitation and medical monitoring throughout the process by physicians to make sure there's no serious concerns or health risks that pop up, or if there's an emergency, there's someone there that knows how to handle it. Um, so we'll just have to wait and see. And I don't know if the push next year in 27 will be to do this limited pilot or something bigger if there's a potential trifecta. So maybe that's something Rep Smith can talk about. But I appreciate the question. And I can share a follow-up link when I get the recording for this on what the links to the training programs are that are already approved in Colorado and Oregon. It's unclear which ones the Office of Cannabis Management would authorize for this state. So I would hold out on just applying to one until we actually have something set up here. But that doesn't preclude you from being a facilitator in Oregon or Colorado if you want. I know a lot of people like have set up businesses there even though they don't live in Oregon or Colorado. So that's also an option.
Yeah. I might just add, this is a good example of like how we are limited by the federal Schedule 1 of this substance is we cannot have, for example, any programs, let alone a licensing program that apply to multiple states, because then that is considered interstate commerce, which of course is under the purview of the federal government, not state government. So anything that any state does, whether it's Oregon, Colorado, New Mexico, or ourself, has to be completely contained within our state boundaries, so that we are not, falling outside of the realm of the federal government or falling into the realm of the federal government where this is completely illegal. And that's another reason that we chose psilocybin instead of something like MDMA, which is created in a lab, because labs are federally licensed. Most labs are federally licensed, which means like labs that are doing this would lose their licensure. And so psilocybin obviously is grown from the ground, so we can do it in our state without crossing state lines. So just something to remember as we're talking about these first steps until there is that rescheduling at the federal level, which I am pushing our federal delegation to do, but that's just a long project. That's something to always keep in mind when we're talking about this.
Yeah, thank you for that. I guess we can punt this question to you, Rep Smith. So for the handful of state reps, this is from Adam Tomzik, who was one of our testifiers. He was one of our task force
Adam's
members.
great.
Thank you
Thank
so
you,
much.
Adam.
So for the handful of state reps who voted against the House bill, what was their stated reasons for voting no?
I think there's kind of three. One's really broad. Is like for some folks, these are generally maybe older folks, like they just don't like the idea of substances being legalized, like any substances. They're against marijuana, they're against this, they're just kind of constitutionally, they do not want this to happen. That's a handful. I think the majority is probably going to fall into one of two camps. One, so for example, Speaker of the House Lisa Dameth voted no on it. I think she just was voting on anything no that cost money. Her big part of her platform is like not spending money. And so even though this is a good program that she might even, agree that it's a good in its focus and its aims, she didn't want to spend money this session to do it. So there's those. Secondly, and I think this is an important group of people that we can speak to, and that as we are talking to folks, this is something we can really allay, especially with actually one of my friends who's a GOP or Representative Bjorn Olsen. He is very concerned as someone who is currently in the National Guard, serves in the reserve. He is a veteran. He has seen a lot of his friends struggle with opioid addiction, and he just in initial discussions, and I think a couple other folks are concerned following the opioid epidemic that is obviously still occurring to jump right into something that, in his words, too good to be true. Is too good to be true. Now, I think most people on this call know that there's a lot more research and publicly available research about psilocybin than there ever was about opioids when they were first pushed on the market, and they are not. Uh, Psilocybin is not profitable for big pharmaceuticals in the same way that opioids was, which is one of the major problems and why it was pushed so hard. But that's an objection that we couldn't overcome this session with him specifically and a couple other folks. So I think those are probably the three main ones that I heard most often. Money, generally just against sort of substances, and concern over is this another opioid epidemic possibility?
Yeah, I remember that conversation and I was a bit frustrated by it because I remember that was coming through when they were trying to legalize recreational cannabis and just conflating,
Yeah,
opiates with these things. It's like, yes, they are both Schedule One drugs. Well, opiates are actually Schedule Two because they do have
right.
accepted medical use. Um, but just like not all Schedule One drugs are created
Yeah.
equal. And I think
These are
that
different substances. They do different things in the body, but it's a long game. I do want to underscore something that Jessica said. It is incredible that we got 80% of the House to vote on this. And one of our main goals coming into this session was to make sure that psychedelic medicine, psilocybin specifically, some of these was not viewed as a partisan issue, that it was not a DFL thing that we were pushing, or but it was something that Minnesotans wanted that we could work together to get to. And I think we did show that. And that's the goal, no matter what happens in the election in November, that we will able to continue to make progress next year.
Yeah, I think the groundwork's set and kept saying like, I think it'll go through this session, but if not, I think definitely next session, assuming we have all the same supporters in the House and the Senate, hopefully.
Yeah.
The roadblock in the Senate, some of the people that were making this process difficult are retiring, so they won't be back next year.
Yeah.
So hopefully.
Yep. One in particular. So that's great.
hmm okay, so next question. So for providers who have training in this spectrum, what would be our next steps? Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I think we're still in kind of a wait and see, but like continuing to stay involved and aware and educated on what's coming through. And then being involved, like if OCM needs additional subject matter experts for people that have done these trainings or are interested in this, I think they're going to need help from clinicians and people that are hoping to be facilitators in the program. So I don't know if there'll be like a call for action or something from OCM or what that would look like, Rep Smith, in terms of like getting people from the community to help them with their report and their research that they're doing until January 15th.
Yeah, well, the direction we gave them was broad, kind of purposefully. I certainly don't think it's outside of the realm for people to maybe reach out to the office and say, "Hey, I've been doing this for a couple of years. If you need someone, let me know." But we'll just kind of have to wait and see, honestly. And then ideally, of course, we'll get that report January of next year, right when we're starting a new session. It's my intention, again, if I'm reelected, to get wording and a program passed very, very quickly so we could start the process of getting that available so people have um, access to these drugs as soon as possible. If you don't know, generally our session, it's a part-time session. It meets part-time legislature that meets between January and May. So that's the point where we're going to see movement again next year.
Yeah, thanks. All right, so we have a question from Marv Gordon. Can anything be done to further move forward at the state city level? Examples, Wallace issues a state order for law enforcement to deprioritize. I don't know if you can do that via executive order or not, like Mayor Fry did in Minneapolis, where we actually do have deprioritization in Minneapolis and I believe also Duluth. I've heard you say that, Rep. Smith. I've never seen
Yeah.
anything announced about that, but I keep hearing it. Maybe they've just been trying to be kind of quiet and low key about it. But it's basically just saying, hey, cops, don't enforce this law. Just don't worry about it. It doesn't mean that you won't get busted for having substances on you, but they can't use that as the primary reason for stopping you or citing you. It has to be secondary to something else that you're doing that's illegal. So that's in effect in Minneapolis and Duluth. Other cities can do it. I know other states like Michigan and Massachusetts have tried to get statewide stuff done, and in the absence of that, they have so many local jurisdictions that have decriminalization that there's pretty good coverage across the state, even though that doesn't make it legal. It just means that you're not going to get busted or get a ticket or maybe go to jail or get a felony just for having it on you or using it. If you're trying to grow it and sell it and have some major business around it, that might be a different story. So do state politicians understand the false pretenses originally used to make psilocybin a Schedule 1 drug, and that most of them probably use a far more dangerous drug, alcohol? I feel that these politicians have opinions based on false information. Thank you, Nixon administration. So do you have thoughts about that, Rep. Smith?
I mean, welcome to the legislature. I mean, politicians making bad thoughts based on their own lived experience rather than the data is something that we live with all the time. Well, I mean, humans live with that all the time. So certainly that's the case. I mean, alcohol, is the class. I mean, it's much more dangerous than marijuana, which was fighting for legalization for a long time. It's much more dangerous than a lot of different substances. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't be careful going into it, of course. But yeah, I mean, I fundamentally agree with you, and I think that's why it's so important that we saw like a lot of people did change their minds on this, right? Like I think we shouldn't focus necessarily maybe on those 15 we didn't get, but like 114 were with us, and that's more than enough to change policy. And a lot of those folks, some of them are like, Rep West and Rep Reimer, who are active champions, but a lot of them are folks who are working in other areas, but they heard the testimony, they listened to some basic understanding and were able to change their mind. So, I think let's focus on the positive that I think we are changing minds, and I think that'll get us where we want to go. And then once, this is more available in communities, I think people will see how helpful this is. That happened with marijuana, like which has a much stronger history of like people having a negative opinion of it, but they saw how it helps some people with anxiety or PTSD, and that has kind of changed cultural thoughts on it as well. Obviously, these are very different drugs and different experiences, very different. But I think that the change in perception by the small, minority that are still not on board, I think will help as more and more people are helped.
Yeah. Yeah, I think those conversations are important, especially in like relationship building. Like I remember Rep West was saying there was one specific House member he's like, this guy's going to be particularly prickly. He's going to be very opposed to this. There's no way you're going to change his mind. And we set up a meeting with him for like 15 minutes. It dragged on for 90 minutes. He had so many questions. It felt like everything I said, he had some excuse or something. But by the end of it, he was a hard no to a maybe, and he eventually voted yes
Yeah,
on the full floor. So it's like people can be reached. You just
yeah,
have to figure out what is the thing that matters to them, and you kind of frame it in that condition. And I think also just in like the broader like wave of support that we're seeing across the nation, it's similar when we started seeing more states legalize medical cannabis. People started to feel differently about cannabis in general. They're like, oh, maybe this isn't just a drug. Maybe this is a medicine. And so I think it just changes, if not the law, it at least changes the public perception of it, which makes it less risky for politicians and legislators to advocate for this. Because that was another thing I heard from some of the Republicans I talked to and lobbied was that they were supportive of it behind closed doors with me, but they're like, my voters are going to think I'm crazy and I'm not going to get
yeah,
reelected if I vote for this. But I think having the federal administration for that party signaling such broad support for this, I think has changed a lot of minds to be like, okay, well, maybe this isn't so fringe anymore. And this is something my
yeah.
own party is behind. And we obviously saw how popular it was in the House. So I don't think that it's as stigmatized as we once thought, given all the movement that's been happening. And I think that's in large part due to the research, to the advocacy, and to, you know, folks like yourself, Rep Smith, who are actually trying to like change the policy on this. So I appreciate that. So I want to be mindful. I'm trying to keep this to 1 hour, just so we're not dragging it on. I know we allocated two. I don't see like a ton of questions coming in. So I'll just get to this next one from Terry. Will we be getting more information from OCM on the feasibility report and collaboration with stakeholders?
I can take this one. So generally, there's not going to be sort of a public call. The language that you saw earlier kind of directs them to do a couple of things, but leaves the like uh, enforcement of those directions in the hands of OCM. So generally, they're not just going to be like, "Hey, everyone, give us opinions," because of course, while those on this call would give good opinions, they would probably mostly get not great ones. I imagine what will happen is they will work with either my office or look at the folks who have testified, reach out, and continue to work on these particular things. I've already given them some names and ideas that I would have for people to work out with, but that is within the administration scope. The other thing to keep in mind that is kind of tough here and is just part of how our system works is, of course, that there's going to be a new administration very soon with an election in November. Governor Walz is no longer going to be our governor. He's finishing his term, and there'll be a new governor who will appoint new commissioners. Not there won't be all commissioners. Sometimes there's some carryover, but there will probably be some new turnover in OCM and Department of Health, and so there will be that is complicating things as well because that'll be a transition right when this report is due. So, probably what will happen is they will do their own administration kind of behind closed doors. But especially if you really have particular expertise, reach out to my office and we'll try to connect as much as we can, which I can put in the chat. It's just rep.andy.smith@house.mn.gov. I know that's very complicated. I will put it in the chat.
Great, thanks. So there's another question from Jason. So OCM will oversee cultivation and distribution with a DEA stamp?
So, we don't go that detailed. I will say in what we directed OCM to do for a feasibility report, they'll cover a lot of that. In our bill, we actually did have OCM be in charge of the administration of the cultivation as well as the testing for the cultivated product to make sure that it's good and then the shipping. So the drug enforcement is federal, so it's not going to be a stamp there. It's going to be again all within the state. So it'll be OCM, maybe working with the Department of Commerce, but probably will all be within OCM. But that's not, I should say, that is what was in our bill. That is not what we passed. The report is much more broad, so they're able to approach that question sort of in with new eyes, not from our perspective. Now, I will be telling them that I think our perspective is best. That's why we did it that way, but they're able to recommend other things if they think that is better. But I also want to tell you that I've said this a lot. Like, I, as a legislature, like my power is from the people. So when I get back in 2027, I can change anything in the report. I shouldn't say I. We, the legislature, can change anything in the report in a bill that we will write and pass. So we don't necessarily have to follow what OCM reports. They will just report like, hey, we think this is the way that we could do it. And then there's still a conversation next time about tweaking that, about making that better, which is why I'm telling people to reach out to my office because even if the report is not exactly what we would want, the bill is still written by, well, it will probably be written by me again if I'm reelected. So keep that conversation going. Hopefully that is clear. I know that was a lot in one answer.
No, I appreciate that. I have a few questions that came from other sources. So one was about, so we hear a lot about the rising costs of people actually wanting to do this, not necessarily the state cost, but how much is it
Yeah.
going to cost for patients that want to access this? And we keep hearing about these like crazy costs coming out of Oregon. I don't think I'm hearing the same stuff in Colorado because people can kind of do it in whatever context they want. They're not restricted to certain things. So one idea that's been floated is like group therapy. So being able to have multiple patients in a room with a couple facilitators, and that can really cut down on the individual costs. Instead of it being $150 an hour, it might be like $50 an hour. Um, so we didn't actually have that in the pilot program because we're trying to
Yep.
do a very slow rollout, making sure, people are focused on the one person getting treatment versus this group setting. But traditionally, sort of indigenously, this is how these kinds of medicines are used, is in this like group ceremonial context. So I'm curious, like, would there be any potential for that in the next version of this bill or expanding the program moving forward?
Yeah, I would certainly be open to that. And I will just mention again, because this is so frustrating, which is why I keep mentioning this and why I want people to advocate at the federal level. The hardest thing that keeps this being expensive is that there's no way right now to force insurance companies to cover this because most of our insurance is federally regulated. And so without regulation at a federal level or even at a state level that moves through the federal system, which is what we do for a lot of our mandated coverages, there's just no way for us to force these multi-billion-dollar companies to cover a treatment that they should cover. So once again, going to put that in there that we need federal action on this. But I will say, yeah, for group therapy, I think that would be something that we could certainly put in the program that I would be in favor of. Of course, always with an option. We want people who are getting this to be as comfortable as possible. So if people are willing to maybe pay a little more or just want to be solo, obviously, I think that's something that should be available as well. And the savings there, obviously, I don't know if you mentioned that, just because like the professional who's actually in the room with the person is what is very expensive for good reason because they deserve to be paid. But if they could be multiple people at the time, that could help defray the cost among multiple people.
Yeah, I would say like I was thinking about this like, okay, if it's going to be a pretty big budget, and what New Mexico did is they allocated money for like a fund that could help offset the costs for patients trying to enter into the program. I think for the pilot, if we had 1,000 people and, for like an 8-hour session running anywhere from 100 to $150 an hour, that's about $1,500 per person to get their first kind of treatment. Because the preparation and the integration could be covered by insurance as just regular talk therapy. That's what they're doing now with ketamine. That potentially the state could allocate, $1,500 per person. That would be another 1.5 million. Would that be a drop in the bucket so that at least everyone gets their first treatment covered by the state? I would love to see that just so that it's less of a barrier, but I know that's a lot of money, but I just want to advocate for that so that it's not such a huge thing. Because we just have another comment in the chat that they spent $1,900 to go do this, that it was worth every penny, but that's really inaccessible for a lot of people.
Yeah, not a lot of people have. I'm so glad that person in the chat got that, but $1,900 is just not accessible for, I would say the majority of folks in Minnesota. Sort of an unexpected $1,900. You'd have to plan for that. So we don't want that as much as possible.
So I'd say closing out, final thoughts, Rep Smith, like how do you see this kind of moving forward, and how can folks get involved, and what should they do to kind of keep the momentum going and support your bid to get this approved in 2027?
Yeah, I would again emphasize like um Jessica and I were working so hard on this during session. We're bummed that we didn't get that language into law at the end. And it really was, I want to emphasize, like, this is how politics works. Sometimes there's one person in the right place at the right time that didn't want to move on this. That is the ultimate reason why we didn't get this. That happens in politics. But if we fast forward to the summer when we were meeting like this in a work group, I said, like, our ultimate goal is to get one hearing that we can have a good hearing and keep our momentum. And we did so much more than that. Part of that was the executive order. Part of that was sort of unexpected allies like Representative Reimer, who came out and really went to bat for this. Uh, and we had a great year that we did get something passed. We are going to have something next year, and it's really something to celebrate. My hope, again, is we will get the implementation study on the 15th of January. I'm hoping to get it a little early because I will be working on actual language for a bill early on next January. Um, I'm a I'm partisan. I'm DFL. I'm hoping that we have DFL control in the House just because that is the best way to use my connections to get this passed. I think we'll again have the decriminalization bill. I think again we will have the psilocybin program. There's other areas that we can still work on. Like I still think MDMA is a great thing for pre-co things. I think uh, there's other areas that we could work on, but I think early on, I would love to get a standalone bill of a psilocybin therapeutic program passed by maybe February or March in like to the governor's desk, whoever that governor happens to be, because we want work to be done very, very quickly on this so that people could theoretically start getting treatment in 2028 because it's going to take a little while to get all the parameters in case, which some folks might think that that's too far away. I understand that, but as far as like how government moves, that's very, very quick. Um, that's my hope. And then obviously there's a lot of different areas that we can continue to push, but if you want to get involved, please email my office, my LA Max. They have a list of people to just send out updates to and questions for. And if we need people to testify, we're going to have to go through several committee hearings next year. Uh, Stay tuned. I mean, this group has been really plugged in the whole time, so I'm sure they will continue to do this. But huge, huge victory overall. Dr. Nielson done an incredible job. We're going to be sad to lose her to Washington, but again, it's good because that's where we need the advocacy as well. And we'll keep pushing.
Yeah, thank you so much. I will say I will be back. I'll be back by August 2027. So hopefully, if things get approved and everything's up and running, I'll be back to help with whatever is needed for that. I know folks do want to see the decrim issue moved. Hopefully, there is space for that in 2027, knowing that we probably couldn't do that without a trifecta. But hoping that that's going to still be as part of the conversation because it was one of the recommendations of the task force.
Yeah.
So thank you all so much for attending. I will be sending out a follow-up email to everyone that registered with a link to this recording, as well as a link to the different facilitator training programs that was asked about. And I'm creating a separate YouTube video that's a compilation of all the testimony and the committee hearings and the full floor discussion about this legislation moving forward. Thank you all so much for attending, and thank you so much, Rep. Smith, not only for attending this event and giving us a good debrief, but just being our champion for the last 3 or 4 years now. Really, really appreciate all your advocacy and support of seeing this through so that we can all have access to this at some point soon.
Happy to do it. And thanks to everyone as well, because we don't do this by ourselves. So thank you all.
Thank you. Bye.